Karoline Leavitt steps into the courtroom, her heart pounding as the judge, who's supposed to be impartial, openly mocks her, calling her a puppet of the left. But just minutes later, something shocking happens. The very same judge, the one who humiliated her in front of everyone, is suddenly in handcuffs. What just happened? How could this man go from a figure of authority to a criminal in the blink of an eye? Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the motivation that drives us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Karoline Leavitt sat quietly at the edge of the courtroom, her hands folded over a slim folder, knuckles pale from the pressure. Her breath came slow and steady, but her eyes didn't lie. She was nervous. No, more than that, she was walking into a storm she already knew wasn't hers to control. The courtroom wasn't huge, but it held enough people to feel suffocating. Rows of journalists, a handful of law students in cheap suits, and donors in crisp blazers watched closely. Karoline had faced crowds before, but this felt different. Here, they weren't looking for answers. They were looking for blood. The judge presiding over the case was Maxwell Carter, a man known for his sharp tongue and even sharper bias. He'd made his name during high-profile hearings where he'd made no secret of his disdain for anything remotely conservative. Some said he was a legal bulldog. Others just called him reckless. Karoline knew exactly where she stood. Her name was called, and she stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from her blazer, and walked toward the witness stand. She didn't rush. Each step was careful, steady, like walking into enemy territory. As she raised her right hand and took the oath, Judge Carter leaned forward, folding his fingers under his chin with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said, voice carrying just enough sarcasm to coat the room in discomfort. "Let's hear what the Gen Z puppet has to say." A couple of chuckles broke out. They weren't loud, but they hit hard. Karoline kept her back straight. She wasn't going to react, not now. "Ms. Leavitt," Carter continued, drawing out the syllables, "you're aware that this isn't a college debate club?" "Yes, I'm aware, Your Honor," she replied, her voice calm, but firm. "I'm here to provide a sworn statement on behalf of the defense." He waved a hand as if brushing away a fly. "Sworn statement," he muttered. "Let's hope it's more than a TikTok monologue." That one drew open laughter. Karoline's heart thudded, but her face didn't move. "I was an official press secretary in a federal office," she said quietly. "I've testified before. I know the process." Carter scoffed. "Experience doesn't mean credibility, Ms. Leavitt, especially not when your paycheck used to come from the West Wing circus." Karoline opened her folder. She wasn't going to argue with him. Not yet. She'd come to testify, and that's what she would do. But every time she started a sentence, he interrupted. Every time she brought up a document, he questioned its relevance before even looking. And slowly, bit by bit, the courtroom wasn't just watching, they were dismissing. A defense attorney rose to object once. Mildly, Carter shut it down with a single raised brow. No one else tried. It wasn't just about her testimony. That much was clear. It was about sending a message. People like her, voices like hers, didn't belong in this space. As the minutes crawled by, Karoline felt a heat building in her chest, not just anger, but something colder beneath it, something like shame, and she hated it. Carter finally leaned back in his chair, visibly bored. "I think we've heard enough. Ms. Leavitt, you may step down." She froze for just a moment, her hand still resting on the papers in front of her. "Your Honor, I haven't," I said. He interrupted, his voice sharper now. "You may step down." She looked around. No one moved. No one spoke. Not one person in that courtroom looked ready to stand beside her. Karoline gathered her papers and stood. Her legs felt heavier than when she came in. As she turned to leave the stand, a court assistant, someone she hadn't noticed before, brushed past her and quietly slipped a folded note into her palm. She kept walking until she reached her seat, sat down, and only then opened it. 5 words, written in neat, almost careful print. "Don't rush. They're watching him." She didn't know who wrote it. She didn't know why. But suddenly, she wasn't just walking away from a judge's scorn. She was walking into something bigger. Noi Dung Chuang Wan. The courtroom emptied slowly. the sound of shuffling feet and soft murmurs hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. Karoline stepped down from the witness stand without looking up, her file clutched tightly against her chest. She didn't need to meet their eyes, she could feel them. The pity, the scorn, the smug satisfaction of those who thought she didn't belong there in the first place. As she made her way back to the gallery, a few heads turned, but most didn't bother to hide the smirks on their faces. One reporter whispered something to the woman beside him, who chuckled under her breath and took another photo. Karoline sat down, her back straight, but her body felt heavy, like her spine had turned to lead. Judge Carter wasted no time reclaiming control of the courtroom. With a voice calm and cold, he began his remarks. This trial, he said, pausing for effect, should serve as a reminder of how dangerous it is when ideologies from the past try to disguise themselves as charity. He didn't name Karoline or the organization directly, but he didn't have to. The insinuation landed with precision. A few jurors shifted in their seats. The prosecution team sat still, unreadable, but one of them allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch upward, just a bit. Karoline's phone vibrated softly in her blazer pocket. She pulled it out and glanced down. A text message, unknown number, no name, just one line. You're the only one with the guts to bring him down. There's something you need to see. Her thumb hesitated over the screen, but curiosity pushed her forward. She opened her inbox, and there it was, a new email. No subject, no sender listed, just a file attachment, a recording. She slipped out quietly into the hallway and found a bench in the nearly empty waiting area. The click of her phone echoed louder than she expected. She tapped play and held the phone to her ear. It was a recorded phone call. A man's voice, confident, measured. She recognized it immediately. Carter, if Liberty wants the outcome adjusted, I need it in writing. He said, no surprises this time. Another voice, muffled but clear enough, replied, you'll have it before the next hearing. But remember, Judge, this isn't about fairness. It's about direction. We're cleaning house. The recording ended. Karoline sat still for a long moment. Her jaw tight, her heart thumped, not with fear, but with something closer to clarity. She had suspected bias, but this was something else entirely. She walked back into the courtroom and handed her phone to her attorney. A man named Gilmore who had been with the case from the beginning. His eyes scanned her face before looking at the screen. After listening to the recording, he frowned deeply and handed it back. This kind of thing doesn't hold up in court, he said quietly. Anonymous source, no verification. They'll say it's doctored, but it's his voice. Karoline argued, her voice low. You heard it. He shook his head. You bring this up now. They'll paint you as reckless, unstable. You'll hurt our chances more than help. A court clerk walked by, hesitated, then kept moving. Karoline caught a glimpse of her eyes, a flicker of guilt. Maybe even recognition, but the woman said nothing. Back inside, Carter had just called a short recess. Before Karoline could sit, she was summoned, not to testify, to leave. Gilmore came over, face pale. Private chambers meeting. Both legal teams. Carter's demanding no further appearances from you. Says it's for the integrity of the process. That's not legal, she whispered. Doesn't have to be, he replied, not if no one stops him. As the doors shut behind the others, Karoline stayed in the corridor, alone except for a few courthouse staff coming and going. She felt invisible again, like she didn't count. Outside, the sun had dipped lower, turning the sidewalk gold. Reporters swarmed the exit, waiting for something, anything, to feed their headlines. She stepped outside, shoulders square, her bag hanging loosely from her elbow. Ms. Leavitt, a voice called out. Do you have anything to say about today's performance? Karoline turned. The reporter shoved a mic forward, flanked by a camera crew. Are you being used by political operatives? Some say you're just a mouthpiece. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't smile. I'll prove what I know, she said, not with noise, not with power, with truth. She turned away from the flashing bulbs and hurried down the steps. Behind her, the camera kept rolling, but she didn't look back. In her hand, her phone vibrated again. One new message, and this time, it came with a name. The email had come with no fanfare, just a subject line that read, You need to know the truth. No signature, no explanation, but attached was a name and a number. Along with a single line. He used to work there. He saw everything. Karoline stared at the message for several long minutes before picking up the phone. Her hand hovered over the call button. There was no guarantee it was real. But after what she'd seen in court, she wasn't sure staying silent was an option anymore. The man who answered sounded cautious. Voice low and guarded. His name was Eric Sloan. He had worked in Liberty Fund's IT department for 4 years before. In his words, he got too curious for their comfort. They agreed to meet at a diner 2 towns over. Away from cameras. Away from the courthouse. Away from people who might recognize them. Karoline drove there herself. No security. No press. Just her and a notepad she barely touched. Eric sat in a corner booth, hunched forward with a ball cap pulled low. He looked younger than she expected. Mid-30s maybe, but his eyes were tired, like someone who'd spent too long watching the wrong people win. "I didn't think you'd actually come," he said. "I didn't think you'd actually answer," she replied. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were screenshots, statements, a copy of a bank transfer, $50,000 routed to a private account belonging to a holding company. That company, in turn, was tied to Carter through a third-party shell. Bonuses for favorable outcomes, Eric muttered, tapping the corner of one page. "They don't write it that clearly, of course. But I was told to delete this chain off the servers. I didn't." There were also emails, cold, transactional notes between Liberty Fund executives and unnamed legal intermediaries. One email simply said, "Appreciate the quick resolution. Consider this a token of continued partnership." Karoline leaned back, stunned. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't a political witch hunt. It was real, it was organized, and it went far beyond her or the nonprofit she was trying to defend. "You ever try to take this to the press?" she asked. Eric laughed, bitter and short. "I sent it to 3 major outlets. You know what I got back? Nothing. Not even a rejection. One editor told me Carter's off limits unless we want to be labeled partisan hacks." Later that evening, Karoline tried again herself. She called in favors, sent emails, reached out to old media contacts. A few responded, mostly with polite nods and vague promises. One reporter from a mid-sized digital outlet, Lisa Trent, showed real interest. They spoke by phone for nearly an hour. But the next morning, Lisa texted her. Editor shut it down. No legal foundation to publish. "Sorry, Karoline." That same day, Karoline's face started popping up across conservative and liberal social media circles alike. Photos from the courtroom twisted into memes. Hashtags accusing her of being a political puppet, a fame seeker, a fraud. Her inbox filled with anonymous messages, most of them cruel. One email called her a disgrace to women who actually worked for their place. Another told her to go back to hiding behind your talking points. It wasn't just digital. In person, people stared longer. Some smirked. Others avoided her entirely. The silence in coffee shops and elevators became sharper, more pointed. She found herself walking a little faster, speaking a little less. One evening, after another fruitless call with a newsroom, she returned to the courthouse to pick up documents for the next phase of the trial. As she waited by the clerk's desk, a woman with salt and pepper hair, dressed in a modest gray suit, approached her quietly. "I shouldn't be saying this," the woman began, eyes darting toward the hallway. "But I saw something." Karoline frowned. "What kind of something?" The woman hesitated, then leaned in. "Judge Carter. He shredded papers right before the first hearing. It wasn't just one document, it was a whole file. Closed the blinds and locked the door. Didn't log anything." Karoline's heart skipped. "I know the layout," the woman added. "There's a security camera in the supply room. It's not supposed to cover that angle. But it does. You want evidence? That's where to look." She walked away before Karoline could ask another question. The courthouse walls suddenly felt closer than usual. Like they were watching. Like they'd always been watching. And for the first time in days, Karoline didn't feel afraid. She felt ready. Karoline waited until the building quieted. It was nearly 7 p.m. when she slipped past the double doors of the clerk's hallway. Her badge still clipped from earlier in the day. She wasn't alone. Monica, the courthouse employee who'd approached her days ago, waited just around the corner. She didn't say much, just handed Karoline a keycard and gestured toward the supply archive down the hall. "You've got 15 minutes, maybe less," Monica said softly. "The feed rolls every 24 hours. You're looking for the 6 a.m. slot. Day of the first hearing." Karoline nodded and pushed through the heavy door. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed above filing cabinets and shelves stacked with boxed records. A single terminal stood in the corner, blinking. She found the footage faster than expected. It was grainy, shot from an odd angle behind the overhead rafters, but clear enough. The timestamp matched. There was Carter, walking into the storage room. He paused, looked around, and pulled a thick folder from under his arm. Then, without hesitation, he tore page after page and shoved them deep into a shred bin behind the desk. There was no audio, no labels on the folder, just motion, but it was him, the judge, destroying something. On the morning of the trial, she saved the file to a thumb drive and exited the room as quietly as she came in. Monica was gone. The next morning, Karoline met with a representative from the courthouse's internal review board. She presented the clip, outlined what she knew. The woman across from her, buttoned up, polite, watched without expression. When it ended, she spoke in measured tones. "Without audio, we can't determine the content of the documents," she said, "and unless you can prove malicious intent, this may fall under discretionary disposal." Karoline blinked. "You're telling me a judge shredding documents related to an active trial is just policy?" "I'm telling you it's not enough," the woman replied. "Not with your history in this case. You're too close, too emotional, too involved." The words stuck with her long after she left the office. By noon, the smear began. An anonymous blog post appeared on a fringe site but spread fast, thanks to a few verified accounts that didn't usually touch gossip. The headline: "Former White House staffer received payments from defendant organization." It came with a blurry image of Karoline, standing near a fundraising table years ago. The organization's logo faint in the background. The photo had been clearly cropped. The caption made up. She called Eric, the former Liberty Fund tech. He didn't answer. By afternoon, she got a text from him. "Sorry, I'm out. I can't risk it." A few calls to media contacts went nowhere. The same voices that once asked for her insights now responded with silence, or worse, polite sympathy. Even her old friend, Alicia, now an attorney at a private firm, called to deliver a quiet warning. "I don't know what game Carter's playing," she said, "but you need to back off before this turns into something you can't clean up." Karoline laughed, but it wasn't out of humor. "I'm not trying to clean anything up," she said. "I'm trying to bring it out." There was a pause. "Just be careful. People like Carter, they don't fall quietly, and they don't fall alone." Karoline hung up without responding. The city felt louder that evening. The sound of sirens, car horns, and pedestrian chatter all pushed against her like waves. When she arrived home, there was a package waiting on her doorstep. Plain brown paper, no label, no return address. She hesitated before bringing it inside, her thumb tracing the edge of the tape. Inside was a small black USB drive. Nothing else. No note, no explanation. Just 3 words written on the label in pen. Original Carter emails. Karoline sat down slowly at the kitchen table, her laptop already open. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed. But something had, and this time, she wasn't going to ask for permission. Karoline sat alone at her kitchen table, the only light coming from the small lamp by the window. The USB drive lay next to her laptop like a live wire. She took a breath, steadying herself, then plugged it in. It took a moment to load. Inside the folder were 6 emails and 1 audio file. The emails were between Judge Carter and someone listed only as D. Harmon at Liberty Fund. But the content left no doubt. Carter didn't speak in code or use vague language. He was direct, almost brazen. "If Liberty is willing to offer financial backing in the next quarter." One email read, "I can ensure a ruling that meets your expectations." Another was even more alarming. The girl, she's a problem. A thorn in the side. If she's allowed to speak again, the narrative changes. That can't happen." Attached to the last email was an audio file. Karoline hesitated. then clicked play. It was Carter's voice. There was no mistaking it. The clip was only 20 seconds long, but enough to turn her stomach. She's young, loud, and idealistic. Dangerous combo. Make sure she doesn't get a second shot on that stand. Disqualify her. Discredit her. Whatever it takes. Her hands trembled as she paused the recording. This wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. And she knew it could get buried in a second if she handed it to the wrong person. So she traced the digital fingerprint on the USB. There was a faint watermark buried in the file's metadata, linking it to a courthouse server. And from there, to a login ID. 2 hours later, she stood in a dimly lit parking garage, waiting near the edge of level 3, where the lights flickered and the cameras often failed. The woman who approached her looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. Her badge read, M. Lawrence. You shouldn't have found me, the woman said, voice flat but not unkind. And I shouldn't have sent it. But I couldn't watch it happen again. Karoline didn't speak. She just nodded. I worked under Carter for 5 years. I knew he played favorites. But this went too far. He thinks he's untouchable. You saved everything, Karoline said. Why? Lawrence looked away. Because the last time someone questioned him, they disappeared. Career gone. Reputation gone. I was terrified I'd be next. So why help me now? Lawrence sighed. Because you're not hiding. You walked into that courtroom knowing exactly who he was. And you stood there anyway. That kind of courage doesn't come around often. She handed Karoline a manila envelope. This has the full log history. Email chains. Internal scheduling notes. Meeting records. But listen carefully. If you go public with this, I can't protect you. I won't deny the files. But I can't stand beside you either. Karoline took the envelope, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. I don't need you to stand beside me, she said. Just don't let them erase it. That night, she drove across town to the regional FBI field office. The agent at the front desk raised an eyebrow when she asked for someone from the Public Integrity Unit. Within 20 minutes, she was sitting across from a young agent named Mark Ochoa. She didn't give speeches. She just opened her bag, placed the USB and the envelope on the table, and said, "This concerns a sitting judge who's manipulating a federal trial for money." Ochoa didn't ask her why she had it. He just said, "We'll need to verify everything. This can't go anywhere public yet." Karoline nodded. "I don't want it public. I want it to be real first." As she walked out of the building, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the wind was colder than it had been in days. Her phone buzzed, a reminder that the trial was still ongoing. She'd be back in that courtroom tomorrow. Back in front of Carter. Back in front of cameras, doubters, and people eager to see her fall. But this time, she wasn't walking in alone. She was walking in with the truth. The courtroom felt colder that morning, not because of the temperature, but because of what Karoline knew was coming. She sat in the gallery, back stiff, fingers clenched around a notebook she hadn't opened. Across the room, Judge Maxwell Carter adjusted his glasses with a calm that felt manufactured. Too polished. The air was thick with anticipation. Then he spoke. "Before we proceed," Carter said, voice steady, "I am issuing a temporary suspension of testimony from Ms. Karoline Leavitt, citing ethical concerns and procedural disruption. Her statements may compromise the objectivity of this proceeding." There was no warning, no due process, just a declaration from the bench. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one objected out loud. Not the prosecutors, not the defense, not the press, just silence, followed by scribbling pens and flashing cameras. Karoline didn't move. She didn't trust herself to. Outside the courthouse, the world turned even sharper. Within an hour, 3 articles had surfaced from major outlets. One called her a radical right-wing disruptor. Another questioned whether she had planted evidence to influence the case. A third suggested her presence at the trial was an orchestrated attempt to delegitimize the court. Every photo they used was from her campaign days, mouth open mid-speech, arm raised, eyes lit with purpose. But the context was gone. All that remained was a label, extreme. By noon, her phone rang nonstop. Most went unanswered. One call came from a former colleague on the legal team of the charity now on trial. "I'm sorry," he said, without much conviction. "This is getting too messy. I can't risk my license over this. I'm out. She understood, sort of, but it didn't make the sting any less. Her email accounts were flooded. Reporters no longer returned her calls. When she logged into her social media, she saw hundreds of messages, most of them vicious, graphic, personal. Her address had been posted on a fringe message board. Her mother had gotten 2 anonymous phone calls last night, someone breathing heavily. Then hanging up. Karoline started locking her doors more often. Then came the moment Carter twisted the knife. He leaned forward in court, voice low but clear. Any witness who is found to have engaged in tampering, deception, or unethical advocacy will face independent legal scrutiny. This court will not tolerate any misuse of its platform. He never said her name. He didn't have to. Karoline walked out of that courtroom with her shoulders drawn in. Not from fear, but exhaustion. Not even the FBI had reached out since she handed over the files. She was starting to wonder if she'd made a mistake, if she'd bet too much on the system. It was raining lightly as she made her way through the plaza toward her car. The streets were half empty. The world moved around her as if nothing was happening, no corruption. No media circus, no sleepless nights, just umbrellas and coffee cups and the shuffle of footsteps. Then, near the parking garage, she saw someone she didn't expect. Melanie Cruz, young, sharp, independent journalist. Karoline had emailed her a week ago, back when she still believed someone would care. Melanie was sitting at a table under a small overhang. Printouts spread before her. Karoline slowed her pace. The wind tugged at the edges of one document. Melanie reached to press it down, and Karoline saw it. The Liberty Fund email, one of the originals. Melanie looked up. Their eyes met. For the first time in days, Karoline saw something besides doubt. She saw curiosity, determination, and maybe, just maybe, belief. The message came through a secure app Karoline hadn't used in weeks. Just 3 words. Let's talk tonight. Melanie Cruz, the young journalist she'd spotted outside the courthouse, had finally broken the silence. They met in the back corner of a small coffee shop in Arlington. Well past dark, Melanie looked different now, tired, cautious, but steady. Her laptop was open before her, a manila folder beside it. She didn't waste time. I verified the headers, she said quietly, tapping the keyboard. Email chains, timestamps, IP routes. It checks out, all of it. Karoline didn't smile. She couldn't. The exhaustion had sunk too deep. But her voice was steady. Will you publish it? Melanie hesitated, just for a second. Then, with a slow nod, she said, yes, but I'm not going through the Sentinel. They already passed on this twice. I'll run it myself. Livestream, open source archive, the whole thing. Karoline reached across the table, slid over a USB drive. Then let's make sure they don't bury it this time. The next morning, an unexpected call shook her out of her fog. Ms. Leavitt, the voice said, this is Agent Donovan with the Bureau. We've reviewed the evidence you submitted. She didn't breathe. We're opening a formal investigation into Judge Carter. But we need you to remain silent. At least until we move. Karoline nodded, even though no one could see her. I understand. But Carter wasn't waiting. By noon, he'd called an internal judicial review hearing. Framed as a procedural audit. Quietly aggressive. He intended to remove all prior testimony from the defense, including Karoline's, on grounds of prejudicial interference. It was the final play to erase her from the record. Melanie messaged her as soon as the hearing was announced. Now or never. Karoline replied with a single word. Coming. The room was packed, senior legal observers, press liaisons, and a half-dozen faces she didn't recognize. Carter sat at the head of the long table, flanked by clerks and counsel. His expression was unreadable, but his fingers drummed steadily against the wood. Karoline took her seat, but didn't wait to be called. She stood, calmly. I request to speak, she said. Carter didn't look at her. This is not a public testimony session. I'm aware, she replied, but the public's already watching. A few heads turned. Melanie, seated near the back, had her phone raised. The live stream had begun 5 minutes earlier. Karoline took a breath, reached into her bag, and placed 3 items on the table: 1 printed email chain, 1 bank record, 1 USB drive. This is evidence of direct communication between Judge Carter and Liberty Fund operatives, discussing financial contributions in exchange for favorable rulings, including this case. Carter's voice cracked as he started. "This is outrageous." She held up a hand. Then, calm and clear, she played the recording. Carter's voice, unmistakable. "She's a problem. A mouthpiece. We can't have her testifying again. Handle it." The room went dead quiet. Someone in the back dropped a pen. Melanie's phone buzzed violently, comments pouring in. Over 400,000 viewers had tuned in. Karoline stepped back. "You tried to silence me. But you forgot something," she said softly. "The truth doesn't scare like I do." Then came the moment no one could have predicted. From the left aisle, a man in a navy suit rose. He pulled a badge from his coat, lifted it into the air. "Judge Carter," he said, voice steady, "I'm Agent Donovan with the FBI. We have a federal warrant for your arrest, and a court order to seize all materials in your possession related to Liberty Fund." Carter stood frozen, his lips parted, but no sound came. Karoline watched, heart pounding but eyes steady, as two agents approached the bench. And for the first time since the trial began, the courtroom stood still, for her. The courtroom buzzed with an uneasy energy as the doors opened and two FBI agents walked in, followed closely by Judge Carter, now in handcuffs. The shock hit everyone at once. Some people stood up and began clapping, unable to contain their relief. Others remained seated, stunned into silence. Karoline could barely hear the faint cheers over the pounding in her ears. But she didn't allow herself to smile. Not yet. The tension was palpable as the agents led Carter to the back of the room, where he was promptly taken into custody. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the silent chamber, a deafening reminder of how swiftly the tide had turned. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, stepping forward to address the judge's former colleagues and staff. "The courtroom is now in recess. We will be reopening a full investigation into the procedures under Judge Carter's jurisdiction." The crowd murmured, unsure of what came next. But Karoline stood still, her mind still processing the events. She didn't know what was happening, but she felt the weight of it in her bones. This wasn't just about Carter anymore, it was about a broken system. A system that had allowed this to happen, allowed him to rule over others with impunity. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around Karoline, mics thrust in her face, cameras flashing relentlessly. She heard the familiar question again. A question she was all too tired of answering. "How do you feel, now that Judge Carter has been arrested?" the reporter asked, his voice carrying the weight of the story he was dying to get on the air. Karoline paused, her expression steady. She had been asked this question countless times, but now it felt different. The eyes of the world were on her. Her heart still raced, but her voice was calm, resolute. "This isn't about me," she said softly, her words measured. "This is about accountability. It's about ensuring that justice is not just a word we say, but something we actually uphold." Her statement didn't satisfy everyone. Some of the reporters seemed to have hoped for a moment of triumph, a headline-worthy quote, but Karoline wasn't interested in a soundbite. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she wasn't going to let herself be swept away by it. As the crowd of journalists and onlookers began to thin, Karoline walked away, the hum of the city's busy streets feeling both foreign and familiar. She didn't feel like a hero, she felt like someone who had simply done what was right. But the pressure of it all was beginning to feel suffocating. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, her phone buzzing incessantly with calls and messages. She barely had time to breathe before another message came through. This time, it was from the former IT employee who had secretly helped her with the evidence. The message was short, but it sent a chill down her spine. "Karoline, I've found more. There are other judges involved, too. Similar payments, similar adjustments. It's bigger than Carter. Be careful." She leaned back in her chair, letting the words sink in. She had expected this, after everything that had happened. She knew this was only the beginning. But still, hearing it, seeing the dark web of corruption spread wider than she'd imagined, hit her harder than she'd expected. Karoline glanced out the window. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the pavement. She had fought so hard to bring the truth to light. But now, It seemed like the light was revealing more than she could handle. The war wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The air was thick with tension, both in the media and in the courtroom. Carter's arrest had dominated the news cycle for days. But now, the spotlight was shifting. A new investigation was underway, and the scope of it was much larger than anyone had initially imagined. At least 3 other judges had been linked to the Liberty Fund scandal. And the accusations were starting to pile up. As the news broke, Karoline found herself caught in the middle of a storm she never expected. Despite the surge of attention, Karoline didn't want to be at the center of the spectacle. She had seen enough of the media circus to last a lifetime. She was invited to appear on a high-profile talk show, but she declined. Instead, she chose to attend a small community meeting where she could speak directly to those who had quietly supported her along the way. As she entered the community hall, she was greeted with warm smiles and quiet applause. It wasn't the flashing cameras or the headlines, but it felt right. She felt like she was finally where she belonged, with the people who understood what she had fought for. The room was small, but it buzzed with the kind of energy Karoline had hoped for. She took her seat at the front, speaking briefly about the journey, the struggles, and the incredible support she had received. But as she was about to conclude her speech, a familiar face stood up in the back of the room. It was one of the defense attorneys from the Liberty Fund case, the very same person who had once vehemently defended Carter. His face was pale, his shoulders heavy with regret. I owe you an apology," he said, his voice trembling. "I was on the wrong side. I stayed silent, thinking you wouldn't make it. I didn't believe you could win." The room fell silent as everyone processed his words. Karoline felt a lump rise in her throat. She had never expected this kind of gesture. It was a rare thing, someone admitting their mistake, especially in the middle of a battle that had tested so many. But even as this moment unfolded, Karoline knew that not everyone would change their mind. There were still people who wanted to discredit her, still those who saw her as a pawn in a larger game. In the back of the room, a group of people whispered among themselves. One of them, a well-known local politician, stood up to address the crowd. "She's nothing but a symbol," the politician sneered, "a puppet created to challenge the system. Don't be fooled by this so-called victory." Karoline's heart sank as the words hit her. The truth was, this fight was far from over. Yes, the system had been exposed, but the people who had controlled it were still out there, still hiding in the shadows, using their power to manipulate the narrative. She could feel the weight of it all, the triumphs and the setbacks, the victories that came with bitter truths. The room was divided. Some believed in her, others didn't. But one thing was clear: the fight for justice was not a clean victory. There were still corners of society that would continue to protect the powerful, no matter what. As the meeting concluded, Karoline walked through the crowd, nodding to those who had been kind to her. She hadn't won everyone over, and she knew that was okay. What mattered was the change she had already set in motion. But as she made her way out, her phone buzzed again. Another email, this time from an anonymous source within Liberty Fund, a former senior employee who had been involved in the fund's financial dealings. She opened the message with a sense of foreboding. "You think it's over?" the email began. "It's just getting started." Karoline stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. The walls of the system she had fought so hard to tear down were far from crumbling. In fact, they were only getting higher. The battle had only just begun. Karoline stood in front of the courthouse, the place where everything had unfolded. A large banner now hung across the front of the building, reading, "Temporarily suspended for internal investigation." The scene that had once been filled with tension and power struggles was now eerily quiet. The echoes of her fight, of the battle she had waged against the system, still lingered in the air. As she stood there, lost in her thoughts, a group of young students caught her attention. They were gathered by the steps, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "We stand with Karoline." The energy they radiated was contagious, their faces filled with hope and belief in a cause greater than themselves. One girl, no older than 18, approached her cautiously. "I want to be a lawyer because of your story," she said, her voice filled with admiration and determination. Karoline smiled softly, the weight of it all sinking in. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't sought out the spotlight. But the ripple effect of her actions had sparked something in others. Something she couldn't ignore. "Thank you," Karoline replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But don't let it be just about me. Make it about the change you want to see." The girl nodded, clearly inspired, before walking back to her friends, who were still chanting, their voices rising in a collective sense of solidarity. Karoline stood there a moment longer, watching the youth of the world standing up for what was right. It was humbling. Later that evening, she returned home. She sat in front of her computer, the screen flickering to life as she checked her inbox. Hundreds of emails had poured in, each one a story of someone who had faced injustice, someone who had been too afraid to speak up for fear of retribution. She opened one email after another, stories of mistreatment at restaurants, hospitals, and schools. People had been looked down upon for their race, their age, their backgrounds, people who felt powerless, voiceless, just like she once had. One email stood out among the rest. It was from a journalist she didn't recognize. But the subject line caught her attention, not just a case, but a system. The email was an invitation to participate in a new investigative documentary about systemic injustice, focusing on the underlying structures that allowed people like Carter to thrive while the vulnerable were crushed under the weight of corruption. Karoline sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, her mind racing. The weight of it all was beginning to settle in. This was no longer just her fight. It was the fight of so many others who had been silenced for too long. She took a deep breath and started typing. This time, she wasn't just writing for herself. She was writing for the people who couldn't speak up, the ones who were still suffering in silence. She was writing so that the next person who came along wouldn't have to feel alone in their struggle. She wasn't just telling her story, she was giving others the courage to share theirs. As she typed, she remembered all the times she had doubted herself, all the moments she had wondered if she was doing the right thing. But now, as her fingers danced across the keyboard, she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just her fight. It was a fight that needed to be fought for all of them. The last paragraph she wrote lingered on the screen. "This story is not just mine. It's the story of every person who has ever been silenced by fear, by injustice, by a system that doesn't care. This story is for you, and for the ones who will follow after me." She hit send, knowing that this wasn't the end, but the beginning of something much larger. Just then, her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number flashed on the screen. She opened it. It was a simple message: "You did the right thing." Karoline sat there for a moment, letting the words sink in, before she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The battle wasn't over yet, but at least now, she knew she wasn't fighting alone. As she prepared to leave her desk, she noticed a news report on TV in the background. A young girl, no older than 12, walked out of a local courthouse in another state. In her hand, she held a printout of Karoline's article, her face set with determination. Karoline's heart skipped a beat as she watched the girl's unwavering gaze, knowing that for some, the fight had only just begun. As Karoline's fight for justice shows us, sometimes the truth isn't just hard to find, it's actively suppressed. But the story doesn't end when we expose the lies, it's a constant struggle. A reminder that we all have a role in standing up for what's right. Will we remain silent, or will we speak out against the injustice around us? What are your thoughts on the system and the people who are supposed to protect it? Share your opinions in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Secrets for more powerful stories like this. Your support helps us uncover the truth, one story at a time.